Swartz and I work at Stellenbosch University. Um, I'm really honored to have been asked to talk at this meeting. Um, I wish that I were there in person to have some in-person conversations, but being far away during the pandemic actually offers some ways of connecting that we didn't know were possible. I'm going to be talking very briefly about something which I'm very pleased the organizers have asked me to do. I'm going to be talking about disability issues, and I'm going to link it to the question of transformation in South Africa specifically, but I think the things I have to say probably have um, more wide significance. Um, and specifically about the question of invisibility, and I hope that there'll be some engagement with the issues that I raise. And I want to start with a story about from the 1980s, which doesn't make me look very good at all. Um, During the 1980s, I was part of a group of psychologists called the Organization for Appropriate Social Services in South Africa, and we were committed to contributing to the struggle for change in South Africa. I think we did a lot of good work. During that time, though, we became aware of more than one instance of gender based violence within the liberation movement. I think about one case in particular where we knew of two um, quite prominent activists who were in a relationship and there was gender based violence in the relationship. And we made a decision, I can't remember whether it was conscious or unconscious, it was certainly never minuted, that the important work that we had to do in the 1980s was the work of broad racial transformation in South Africa, that issues of um, gender based violence would have to wait, that the important struggle now was a struggle about race and class. As anybody who knows contemporary South Africa and the history of the Jacob Zuma rape trial and our enormously high rates of gender based violence will know, this was a mistake. It was a mistake at the time because we were turning away from something that was very important in terms of struggle and rights. But it's had implications, I think, for gender relationships in South Africa, including at the highest level. We turn away from unfashionable issues of difference and oppression at our peril when we see that there are more important issues to deal with. And I'm going to be coming back to this. Now, South Africa has very progressive legislation in terms of disability. Our constitution, which was finalized in 1996, has been much hailed globally for its inclusion of disability. And we have excellent legislation on employment, education. We've got very good employment equity laws and so on. I'm very proud that South Africa played a very key role in the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Excuse my typo, there shouldn't be an apostrophe before the S there. Um, uh, South Africa was very active in the formation of the UN CRPD, and I think it's fair to say that there are South Africans who are really leading the way in terms of disability studies in Africa and globally. I think of colleagues like Gubela MG, who's the head of AfriNeed, which I'll talk about in a minute, Brian Watermeyer, who wrote what for me is the most important book on psycho-emotional disablism, and various others. We've done quite well. AfriNeed as a project was started by Gubela MG, who is professor of disability and rehabilitation studies at my university. It's the African Network for Evidence to Action on Disability. And there are a number of active country working groups across Africa. There are there's been a lot of progress. Um, AfriNet established the African Journal of Disability. I have to admit that I'm biased here because I was the founding editor-in-chief of the journal. It's a credible international journal. We're now on PubMed, Scopus, Cielo. We are considered, I think, as a serious journal. I think South Africans have been very central in certain kinds of developments, notably the development of community-based rehabilitation, particularly in Africa, but also more broadly, and in parasports. We do know that the Oscar Pistorius case was something of a problem, to use a euphemism in relation to that. But in terms of disability inclusion in sport, South Africa remains um, a world leader. South Africa is also very interesting on the African continent because um, we're a very unequal country, which I'll come to, but we're practically unique, not entirely, but practically unique on the African continent in that we have a disability grant for adults with disabilities who fall below a certain income level, and what's called a care dependency grant, which is for children with disabilities. Um, Paradoxically, those social security, very important social security benefits, because whole families live on disability grants, old age pensions, and care dependency grants. Um, all of those come from our apartheid history. They actually they were initially available for white people and they were expanded. But nevertheless, South Africa is a leader um, in this area. But of course, we worry about progress, and um, uh, progress is slow. Um, so, some recent work has shown good progress in many areas in South Africa um, relating to race and gender. I am part of a group which is working on an intersectoral assessment of social progress in South Africa, and I have the data, which I don't have time to show you, but in terms of racial transformation, none of it's fast enough, but racial transformation, gender transformation, we can show that there is progress, but really not much around disability. Um, and there are particular um, problems in terms of employment equity. So we have employment equity targets. There's even a suggestion that after the first decade of South Africa's democracy, there's been some backsliding. So things have got worse in terms of disability equity. It's very well established that there are problems in the administration of grants. Sophie Mitra and Gabrielle Kelly have written about this. Um, in fact, Zara Trafford and I have just had today, just before I came on air, a piece on the administration of the dependency grant, which shows the administrative problems. And there have been many analyses of the of what's been termed the aspiration implementation gap in terms of disability in South Africa. And I think probably the best analysis comes from Black and Dematos Alta a few years ago. And I can't go into all of these in detail, but would be happy to discuss them. South Africa has, for a range of reasons, adopted a neoliberal development strategy, partly because of where we're located in terms of the global economy. And there are deep ongoing inequalities, not just about disability, far from it. We remain the most unequal society in the world. And if we're not the most unequal, we're one of the top five. The, they mention public sector capacity limitations, so the people who are tasked with implementing the kinds of changes that we need in relation to disability often are not trained and do not have those specific skills. There are many dilemmas in South Africa around mainstreaming. Part of the problem with mainstreaming, and we'll talk about this a little bit more later, is you can mainstream, but um, some issues tend to disappear. They tend to get drowned out by other ones. There's an enormous gap between formal social norms, which are very disability inclusive, and as many um, social indicators surveys show informal norms, which show how conservative South Africa is as a country, and some disability discrimination. Um, and a huge problem in South Africa is that we had a very strong, vibrant disability sector and very good activism. And many of these people have been taken up into government positions with the transition in South Africa. So that disability activism in South Africa is really not what it was during the struggle years. Part of my area of interest is disability change in universities, because I work in a university myself. And again, there's been some progress. There's a development of strong disability units, and there's a good network of disability units across universities in South Africa. The private sector is providing quite good financial support for students with disabilities, and there are strong enclaves of disability work and research. But the reality is that the progress is slow in terms of participation of students and academics and others with disabilities in the academic project. There are often limited support, and there are enormous problems in terms of employment equity. There are very, very few academics with disabilities employed in South Africa, and there are a range of reasons. Some of them kind of structural, but I would like to focus on some of the more psychological. Uh, Issues. So some of the issues in universities are clearly pipeline issues, that there are problems earlier in the education system. Um, with educational mainstreaming post-apartheid, we have inclusive policies, but when you include people with disabilities in schools where there is not proper resourcing, often they actually get ignored, and there's some indication that they look like they're being included, but they're actually getting worse resources than when they were in segregated schools. Um, it's Segregation is a dirty word in South Africa for obvious reasons, but it remains the case that's some of the schooling is in very particular religious context, and there are huge competing demands in universities in South Africa. Some people have said that universities in South Africa have to be states within states. We have to provide housing, transport, all sorts of things generally because our students come from poor backgrounds and can't afford. So there's pressure on the university to solve, in some senses, social problems, and this goes for the majority of students, in fact, um, which leads to the invisibility of students who may have needs which are seen as additional to the others. Um, Part of the problem, obviously, in universities and more generally, is that most disability is indeed hidden or invisible. And the issue of disability diversity is that it obscures the range of accommodations which may be needed. But I think that there's something more fundamental going on. Rosemary Garland Thompson, who many people know, she's an American, talks about the politics of staring. We've been trained not to look, not to see disability. From a psychological point of view, there are certainly fears amongst my colleagues that if we talk about students and disabilities, they'll compound damage. There are fears about confronting issues of vulnerability. And disability forces us to talk about topics which are often seen as distasteful or impolite. So a lot of the fights that I've had in the university have been around toilets, lack of access to toilets, and people find it quite difficult to talk about those things. But I think another problem that we face is that in the very nature of the pipeline issues into higher education in South Africa, we have many very competent students with disabilities, and in some ways that's seen as kind of erasing disability. Well, then then you're not disabled, you don't have needs, and so on. And so all of this kind of stew relates, I think, to complex ideological and emotional traps, which we see in South Africa in general, and certainly within our universities. Um, the number of times I've heard people as a compliment saying, "I don't see you as disabled," which is an insulting lack in terms of the politics of recognition. It's like saying to a person of color, "I don't see color." Heidi Lawrence, who is an academic with a disability at University of Johannesburg, talks about her response to this of what she calls super cripping the academy, where she as a disabled staff member um, overcompensates and does more work than anybody else and does better than any other um, uh, academics. There's this paradoxical idea that competence is kind of seen as as a betrayal of disability status. But I think we still in South Africa live in a situation where disability issues, although formally they're seen as rights issues, they're seen as charity issues. Um, Ongoing accommodations are difficult. The politics of time in universities is a very complicated issue, and disability often has implications for time. And um, the whole issue of diversity can become quite sort of watered down. Waldring and Lillywhite have just published a piece showing that in universities in the UK, um, disability mainstreaming sort of drowns into gender mainstreaming. And colleagues of mine keep saying, of course, we're interested in disability inclusion. It goes without saying. Well, of course, if you don't say something, you leave it out. Um, Intersectionality is really important in our in our context, but I think in practice in South Africa we see some problems of the misuse of intersectionality. So we have what's I term subtractive intersectionality, which is if you are white but disabled, you consider that it's not possible for you to be oppressed at all because whiteness cancels out everything else. There is a selective intersectionality. So there's a focus on specific and highly visible social markers. So currently, as there should be, there's a huge emphasis in South Africa on gender nonconformity, gender diversity, and so on. But disability is not at the moment uh, 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 flavor of the month. There's also what I call historical last instance intersectionality. So I've heard people say, we're not interested in disadvantage in South Africa in general, in terms of, we're not interested in human rights in South Africa in general. We're only interested in people who have been specifically disadvantaged by apartheid, which is highly problematic because we want to build an inclusive um, society. So in summary, in South Africa, disability is very similar to other forms of exclusion, but it isn't. Um, we need these multiple um, foci, both on mainstreaming and on a specific focus. I find people very tired of hearing about disability when I talk about it, but we have to do this. And every silence, including silences around disability, are a form of violence. And in the context of student politics in South Africa, which many of you may be familiar with, there's been a selective politics of the body. And not enough emphasis on the range of bodies which are excluded um, in the South African system. And very importantly, a lack of emphasis on the way in which apartheid and an extractive economy itself is disabled and creates disabling bodies. So here I am in 2021 talking to you about the progress that we've made, but really about the relative silence and invisibility of disability in South Africa. So I'm telling you a story from the 2020s, and it is really my hope that we will not be around, I may not be around in 2040 or 2050 or whenever it is, looking back to the 2020s saying, we thought that there were other things that were more important in South Africa in the 2020s, and these issues were race, class, gender, gender diversity, gender nonconformity. And we thought we'll get to disability later. Because the minute you say, and I think I learned this lesson from being in the struggle in the 1980s, if you ignore something now, you ignore it in the future. And I think that this is not just a South African story. I have data which I haven't had the time to show about the extent to which disability has been ignored globally in progressive psychology journals, journals which are interested in community work. There's a relative lack of emphasis on disability rights and access. And my experience has been, and my view, is that we ignore these apparently less important issues, less urgent issues, less popular, less obvious issues at the peril, and it's at the peril of inclusion and human rights for everyone. Thank you very much for your attention, and I hope that we do have some discussion. Thank you.